Welcome to the third part of Chapter 10. In this part of the chapter, we're going to talk about the second point in the strategic marketing process, and that is making market selection decisions, and specifically we're talking about segmentation and target markets. So when we talk about making market selection decisions, we have to do this in several reasons why we do this. Expansion into international markets. How do we go about doing that? What are some thoughts? How do we go about segmenting in our target market? So once we know who our consumers are and what they desire, we must then determine where we should meet them. Where should we put our brand? In other words, where should they see us? To do this, we have to first understand the reasons for international expansion, and then how do we segment that market, and then specifically how do we target that market. And so if we look at some of the reasons that a company would want to expand their reach to international markets is first when the domestic markets are saturated. So how do we determine if a market is saturated? We first have to analyze it. And so this is where you may have heard of a term called SWOT analysis. The SWOT analysis stands, it's an acronym that stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So again, that's SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But what we're essentially doing is analyzing the environment. When I say the environment, that includes internal and external environment. And so strengths and weaknesses are considered internal. Strengths will be those things that you do well. What I mean by you, meaning the brand. What is it that it is? What about your brand is good right now? What is it that you can take and build onto? Okay. The weaknesses are the opposite, but they're also internal. So what is it that your company does or your brand does that is not so great? What are some things that you can do better? So strengths and weaknesses are internal, also known as controllable factors that you can affect. And so by understanding who you are, where you're coming from, what you do well and what you do poorly, you can then try to fix those things and move in potentially into an international market. But if we look at the opportunities and the threats, the O and the T of the analysis, opportunities are those things or expansion into areas, either new product development or new markets, which is what we're talking about here, which are external and uncontrollable, things that we might be able to move into, and then threats, which are external, things that could harm our ability to move forward. So the typical threats would be competition. You can't control what your competition does, but you can affect how they respond to the market as well. But your competition is an example of a threat. But it could also be things such as political, economic, social, and technological aspects. And we'll talk about a pest analysis here in a second. And so that's the first reason. So if the domestic markets are saturated after we've done a SWOT analysis, we realize, you know what, we have the opportunity. We've kind of tapped out the market we're in now, but we have an opportunity to move globally or into a new international market. That may be the reason for the expansion. Second one is domestic sales may be declining. In other words, you notice that the sales in your certain area or the region in which you are selling your product and marketing to are starting to plateau or decline, and therefore you need to expand to a new market to increase the sales opportunities. Third one would be to expand, or more what I mean is revive the product life cycle. And so the product life cycle has typically these 5 different stages. Development, launch, growth, maturity, and decline. And so essentially, if you are in a process where you're starting to either mature or decline, entering an international market might be able to help you revive or restart this cycle to launch, growth, maturity. And so the point I'm getting to is that is another reason for expanding to an international market. Fourth reason may be because we know that in some global markets, they behave very similar to the way we might do business. So maybe it is a European company, a European brand that understands they could probably sell the product they are to a consumer group in the United States or in South America or wherever it may be, because they have similar characteristics of the consumer. If that's the case, expanding to an international market is relatively easy to do. The fifth one is technology and transportation. Make it easy. This would be more geographical expansion into international markets. For us in the United States, it would be easier for us to expand to Canada because they're our close neighbor. Geographically, transportation is easy. We have lots of of routes, both air traffic as well as road and train, and the ability to move goods as well as services or people. And then the sixth will be national success drives a global desire. So we've done really well in one market. Let's strive for global expansion. And so a common way that we have to determine if marketing a product internationally is a viable option and whether or not it will be successful is to conduct what we call a pest analysis. A pest analysis is political, economic, social, and technological activities. So essentially what I'm looking at is what are the political aspects of the country I'm moving into. And so what you would do is take, let's say you're currently marketing in country A. In country A, you've decided that, I don't know, the domestic market sales are declining and you want to expand to an international market. Well, before you move into country B, you have to do some research on country B. Country B, you have to do a pest analysis for. So what does the political system look like? Is it a democracy? What is it? How is their government structured? And how might that government structure affect your business? Is there a good political relationship between country A and country B? Because if your headquarters is in country A, the laws that apply in country A may be different than those in country B. This kind of moves us into the second aspect, which is our economical analysis. And so what is the structure or strength of the economy in country B versus country A? How would you go about being able to transport materials? Let's just say you're importing and exporting goods from country A to country B. Are there tariffs? Are there embargoes? Those are the types of things you have to look at, which is kind of your political economic meshing. And then you have to look at the social aspect or social analysis. A lot of that comes back to culture. Are there things that are done in country A that are unacceptable socially in country B? Or are they very similar? And why are they similar? Are there certain religious principles in country A or country B that will dictate how you run your business? And so this goes back to our reasons of talking about communication and language and how religion and cultures are different between countries. This is where we analyze that. And the last one's the technological analysis, and this is focusing on whether the infrastructure and the technology in country B is capable of hosting our company or expanding into that market. If we do most of our sales currently in country A through internet sales or through telemarketing or whatever it may be, does country B have the same access to the internet and phones that country A has and their consumers? Because then if you don't, then you may have an issue in how you go about doing sales. And you may want to rethink expanding to country B. And so your assignment in this part of this chapter is to do a pest analysis. So look at the Dropbox activity for that. So let's talk about segmentation. Market segmentation, the way we look at it, is essentially it's defined as identifying groups of consumers based on their common need. Essentially what we're talking about is if you take a pie, a circle so to speak, and if you divide up that pizza or that pie into half, we could say on one side is one segment and the other side is another segment. The way we do this in the marketing aspect is I take a group of people, that market is symbolizing the pie, or the pie is symbolizing the market, that is. And I might say in Texas, if I divide male and female, I'm basically creating two different market segments. Okay. If I say males 18 to 32, I'm making a very smaller market segment. Okay, so I'm dividing up the pieces of pie. That is essentially what a market segmentation is. But you're doing it based on common needs. And so why would we do this? What's the whole purpose? Well, the purpose of market segmentation analysis is to understand where your prospects are coming from. Okay, so how do we go about doing it? Well, we divide the market up based on several different things. Demographic segmentation. This is our basic understanding of how we divide the market up based on characteristics that are readily accessible to us. In the United States, for example, demographic information for markets are generally available through the U.S. Census Bureau. I can find out typically what the annual household income for a city is, or a community, or a zip code. I can find out how many males are there, how many kids under the age of 18. Those are the types of things that I can figure out. Demographic variables would be gender, ethnicity, household income. Sometimes you can find out education level. Those basic characteristics that we can find out about people. It's good if we segment based on demographics because it's relatively easy. The problem or risk that you have when you enter into demographic segmentation is generalizing. And just like we mentioned in culture, we cannot say that because somebody is a member of one culture, they believe everything in that culture and are no different than anybody else. That's the same that I can say that if I say I will market to all males in the same way, well, all males are not the same. They don't have all the same beliefs. They don't have all the same consumption behavior. And so we have to be aware of demographic segmentation is easy and is general, and most of the time organizations do that, but there are some limitations to it. Second one is socioeconomic segmentation. This will be focusing specifically on social class. And so that would be household income, wealth, sometimes education level is put into there. And while you may, in our society, by definition, social class is not based on race, many times we see racial trends in social class systems, and this is where we have a lot of the issues in our, at least in the American society and across the globe. But social class systems, depending on the country you are entering or working within, are stronger than others. And so that's something you do when you investigate that country before you move into it. Psychographic segmentation is essentially looking at the internal thought processes or the reasons why people do things. And so there's lots of different ways to understand why do I participate in action sports versus why I don't participate in tennis. And so it's the internal thought processes and the personality traits that influence. So maybe I want somebody I want to market to somebody who is daring or outgoing or exciting. Those are the types of things that psychographic information may be able to give us. Geographic information would be based on location. So maybe I only want to market to people in Texas or in the South, or I want to market to people in Mexico and not Canada. Those are the types of geographic segmentation. I choose a region and I market to everybody in that region the same way. Behavioral segmentation is essentially how we go about finding information. And so how do I go about searching for information about my sport that I want to watch or I want to participate in? And then geodemographic is a combination of geographic segmentation and demographics. So I might say I want to market to only Hispanics in Texas that have 2 children at home, right? I'm specifically saying Texas is my geography, and I'm saying demographics in that it would be Hispanics that have at least 2 children at home. So market segmentation, there are basic requirements to market segmentation. In order for me to create a segment, I have to look at 4 different things. One, the segment that I create. Let's take that last example, Hispanics in Texas with children under 2. Can I measure that in purchasing power and size? Can I go about finding how many people are Hispanic in Texas with under 2 kids in their household? And the answer is yes. Generally, U.S. Census Bureau, I can try to figure that out. There's some other market information I can figure out. And can I figure out what their purchasing power is? Well, yeah, I can probably figure that out because annual household incomes, as well as other types of information out there. So is it measurable in purchasing power? Yes. And in size? Yes. So if that's true, then move on to the next one. Marketers must then effectively promote to and serve that segment. So can you effectively promote to and serve Hispanic households with children under 2 in Texas? And the answer is probably yes. Essentially, what you want to look at is your market so small or so broad? Do you know enough about that market to be able to promote to them? And the third one is the segments must sufficiently be large enough to be profitable. And so the first question was, the first requirement was, can I measure them in power and, more importantly, in size? And the answer is yes. The third question is, now that we know the size, is it large enough to make us a profit? And so number one and number 3 are oftentimes, when I talk to students, they get confused as, well, you said size in number 1, but also in number 3. Size in number 1 is, can I even figure out how many there are? Number 3 is, now that I know how many there are they large enough that I can make a profit off of it? In other words, are there only 10 households in Texas with Hispanics with 2 children? Well, no, there's a lot more than that. So, yeah, probably would be profitable. And then the fourth one, the last one, is the number of segments that you're creating must actually match the firm's capabilities. And so I might say I'm interested in Hispanics in Texas with 2 children at home, but I'm also interested in Hispanics with only 5 children at home, Or in addition to that, I want to look at single Hispanic families. Well, I'm kind of have the same trait. All of the number of segments means I'm marketing differently to different groups of people. Do I have essentially enough staff, enough of resources within my company to be able to do that? And those are things you have to answer when you create a market segment. If the answer is yes to all of the different segmentation types, basic requirements, then you probably have a decent or acceptable market segment. So how does that have to do with target markets? Well, market segmentation, again, is dividing the market up based on consumers having the same or common needs. Okay? Market segmentation, there's different ways to do it. But let's just say you market or develop your segment, into males age 18 to 32 in Texas. All right, geodemographic segmentation. I'm then taking that segment and I'm metaphorically taking that piece of the pie and I'm eating it. In other words, marketers are taking 18 to 32-year-old males as their target market. They're specifically sending marketing messages to that group of people. So it's defined as choosing a segment or a series of segments that allow the organization the most efficient and effective way to attain its marketing goals. When we look at markets that are very small, have a very special need that may not be currently being met, we're talking about niche markets. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced niche markets, but niche markets are, again, carving out a relatively small part of the market, basically creating a very small segment. This is where you have to be careful with your 4 basic requirements of market segmentation. They have a very special need that's not being met, and your hope is that by segmenting a niche market and targeting them, sending marketing messages to specific groups of people that are relatively small, you're hoping that they'll grow into a mainstream market. Look at sports as an example. Mixed martial arts in the 1970s was known as a niche market because there was very few opportunities for you to watch the game. There's a lot of history behind that. If you're interested in it, send me an email. I'll tell you all about it. But MMA, essentially in the 1970s, became popular through the 80s and 90s because of changes in laws and states, as well as the advent of satellite technology and more people having access to pay-per-view technology. And so it became a niche sport. So marketing that niche sport is now what we consider mainstream. It's on television all the time. Action sports were the same way. So few people knew what action sports were all about, and now we see it as being a mainstream. CrossFit could be another example of a niche sport turning to mainstream. Well, the reason why when we look at target markets is sometimes we deal with that in the same respects for sponsorship. So being a large revenue source for most organizations, there's a considerable overlap between sports fans and other industries. These other industries could be professional services such as airlines, e-commerce, consulting, and accounting firms. So if you ever watch the World Cup, you typically see in the World Cup several airlines, typically those that are serving the market in which the airline or the event is happening. You can see banks and consulting firms and accounting firms typically found. Another one would be leisure activities, so resorts and cruises and casinos. So if you ever watch a sporting event, typically you'll see some sort of leisure service. And automobile dealers are also ones that are notorious for getting in front of consumers during games. Well, why? Because people who watch sporting events typically have higher disposable income and income as well as discretionary time. Their marital status oftentimes fits the desires of these sponsors, and the mean age for sporting events are those that are typically in their target market. And so again, target markets help us as marketers for a sport organization find consumers to watch our events or participate in our events, but it also helps other industries market to consumers. So again, kind of to wrap up, in the first step of process, we have to, in the sport industry, understand the consumer's needs. We have to understand who the customers are. Are they participants? Are they consumers? In the second step, we have to, once we know about who our consumers are and what they desire, must determine where we should meet them. To do this, we have to determine our reasons for international expansion. So that was the very beginning of this video. We have to then segment our market using one of the different market segmentation types, and then choose of those market segmentations, who should we actually target. And so that is our second step in the strategic marketing process.